Chapter 14. Evacuation. In a ruined plaza stood 4 giants. Amidst the piles of rubble and broken corpses, the transhumans were shining, golden avatars of perfection. 3 of them would have towered over mortal men, but the 4th made even them seem small, like a pale reflection of the sun. For he was a Primarch, the Praetorian of Terror, Rogel Dawn. He faced away from his sons into the ruins as they shouted back and forth in heated argument that had clearly been raging for some time. The first was shaven-headed, his golden armour trimmed with black and white, with a magnificent sword at his belt. His name was Sigismund, and he was shouting, "Captain Catafalque is behind schedule. Dantalion, signal him that he should have reached his primary objective an hour ago." The second marine stood in armour that had been scorched bare, like he'd been standing in the path of a blowtorch, leaving blank ceramite, and shouted back, "Catafalque's company is enveloped on 3 sides. They struggle to survive, let alone advance. His company will stand until the last man, but that won't be long. Then the entire left flank is gone." "Then signal Captain Rythen to move up in support," snarled Sigismund. "Impossible," said the third. "A giant among giants, almost as tall as Rogel Dawn himself, with arms stained red with the blood of traitors." "What do you mean, Pollux?" asked Sigismund. "Rythen was overrun 30 minutes ago. His whole company is dead," replied Alexis Pollux. "Rythen's gone?" said Sigismund, quite startled. "Then exactly what reserves do we have left?" "There are none," replied Pollux in a voice of doom. "This situation is beyond saving," stated Dantalion, saying what they all knew to be true in their hearts. "We must fall back and consolidate. Get as many men out as we can." "Retreat?" cursed Sigismund. "We are the Imperial Fists. What kind of marine are you to suggest such a thing?" "Open your eyes! We're dying on our feet here!" yelled Dantalion. "The only thing holding the line together right now are Guilliman's successor chapters." "Mongrels!" snarled Sigismund. "They've disgraced their Emperor-approved colours with this folly." "Mongrels or not, they're the only thing standing between us and a pointless death," bellowed Dantalion. Our options now are between an orderly withdrawal and total annihilation. Pollux, surely you cannot agree with this blinkered madness. You must see we have to fall back." Pollux crossed his blood-stained arms and said, "Our Primarch has not given me any such order," he said with finality. They all turned to look at their golden lord, who continued to gaze into the distance and said nothing. "Brothers, see sense," pleaded Dantalion. "We are beaten today, but there will be other days, other battles. If we fall back now, in good order, we can still prevent a total rout." "We must have agreement before we can issue such a command," replied Pollux firmly. "I will die before I give such an order," snarled Sigismund. They were all shocked into silence as Rogel Dawn drew a slow breath and uttered, "The Emperor's own will not yield before traitors. No retreat, no surrender." The assembled captains stared at their Gene-Father. Then Dantalion said, "Well, that's the end of that then." Pollux was not listening, but looking up at the sky as a large shadow passed over them and said, "I'm not so sure." From the skies swooped a massive storm bird, every inch gloriously engraved and enamelled the deepest ocean blue. It fell upon the plaza with thruster downwash, knocking loose stonework and swirling up cyclones of dust. It filled the plaza, yet still seemed insignificant compared to the being that was jumping from its open hatch. He was every inch a son of the Emperor, from the magnificent workmanship on the armour of reason, the mighty hand of dominion on his arm, to the white blonde locks on his brow. He was the match of Rogel Dawn in every way, but where the Praetorian of Terror was resolution and defiance made manifest, Rebute Guilliman was precision and rationality incarnate, and at his side hung a truly wondrous blade. He strode past the officers straight up to his brother and called out, "Rogel, what are you still doing here? You should be halfway to orbit by now." "You are wearing father's sword," replied Dawn gravely. "What?" said Guilliman, taken aback by the non sequitur. "His sword," growled Dawn. "Why are you wearing it?" Guilliman returned a worried stare and said, "It was functional." "It is not yours to wear," snarled Dawn. "You would prefer I left it to gather dust in some reliquary?" barked Guilliman. "Rogel, we have no time for this. I am here to evacuate you, not argue." "Arrogance and presumption," stated Dawn harshly. "I should have expected no less from one who usurps the Imperium itself." "Rogel, what are you saying?" said Guilliman. "I am saying you should leave," growled Dawn. "My legion is staying to finish this fight." "Are you deluded?" shouted Guilliman. "You cannot believe you can defeat the 4th Legion here today?" "No," stated Dawn fatally. "We cannot." Roboute was taken back. "You would die here for the sake of pride?" he said in disbelief. "For principle," snarled Dawn. "You may have your damned practicals, but my sons understand what it is we truly fight for." Sigismund stepped forward and declared, "The traitors must be made to understand there shall be no mercy for them, no respite from the vengeance of the Emperor. That we die is unimportant, for we shall send a message to the whole galaxy. No pity, no remorse, no fear." "Go, Roboute," said Dawn firmly. "Take your mongrel chapters, and my sons will show you what it means to live and die as servants of the Emperor." With that, Rogel turned his back on Roboute and faced stoically away into the ruins. Thus, he was totally unprepared when the hand of Dominion swung around and caught him across the back of his head. The blow was a sledgehammer of force, and had the fist's power field been active, it would have sprayed his brains across the plaza. As it was, the impact of the blow sent him spiraling into the dust, totally unconscious. The assembled officers stood dumbfounded over the prone Primarch as Roboute shook some feeling back into his hand. Dantalion stepped forward and opened his mouth, but never got to say what he intended, for Guilliman pierced him with a gaze that could have shattered bedrock, and the Marines saw the depths of anger that he kept under rigid control. For long seconds they stared at each other, and then the captains broke eye contact. Sigismund was the last, but then even he lowered his gaze and submitted to the avenging son's will. "Lord Dawn has been relieved of duty," said Guilliman. "You are now in my command. Give the order to fall back and evacuate." "Sir, with respect, you do not understand our legion," said Dantalion, eyeing his unconscious Primarch. "Our lord commanded us to hold our ground, and without a direct order from him, there are no words that will make an imperial fist step back." The Eagle of the East said nothing, only turning his head and giving Captain Pollux a knowing stare. In response, Alexis put his hand to his Vox Mix and said, "All 7th Legion forces, this is Captain Pollux. Lord Dawn is injured. I repeat, Rogel Dawn is down. Our Primarch requires urgent medical evacuation. He needs you to fall back immediately and form a rear guard." He turned to the Lord of Ultramar and said, "That will get them moving." "Good," said Guilliman, picking up his unconscious brother as easily as a rag doll. "We have minutes before Perturabo moves to block our extraction. Coordinate a fighting withdrawal. Wounded first, then anyone who can walk. Forget heavy equipment. Today we save lives. Then get yourselves on a gunship. Sigismund, no theatrics about being the last man to leave the planet. The Imperium needs you alive." Then he carried his brother up the ramp of his Stormbird, and in a howl of thruster downwash, the Primarchs were gone. Chapter 15. The chamber was dark and echoing, filled with the shadowy ruins and crackles of fire burning low in the hearth. Into this desolation marched two figures with heads held high. One was a giant, even for an Astartes, with fists still flecked red with blood despite repeated cleansings. The other walked in armour scoured clean of all colour and insignia, bare plate attesting to the fires he had marched through. The two Astartes gazed around the room and surveyed the wreckage. Strewn around were the remnants of Rogel Dawn's personal items. Desks and precious manuscripts torn to shreds and pieces of glorious armour thrown so hard into the marble walls. Slowly they advanced through the darkness until they found the Primarch himself, forlornly gazing at a stained glass rendition of the Emperor, the only intact thing left in the room. His body was covered in sweat, and his chest heaved as a testament to the rage that had coursed through him upon awakening to find himself back on the phalanx. As ever, he wore a stoic mask of control, but it was cracked, and for the first time one could see the anger and sorrow behind it. The two Astartes stood there, until without looking around, Rogel at last said, "Alexis Pollux, Aureax Dantalion, you should not be here." Pollux bowed and said, "Sir, we've come to express our concerns regarding the state of the Legion. The companies are shattered, and these last few weeks there has been a dangerous trend towards cults of personality forming around the surviving captains. Unless you step in, the Legion will be torn apart with ideological divisions." Dantalion stepped forward and said, "Sigismund is inundated with fanatics and zealots begging to join his Templars. The recruits are following Pollux here like chicks around a mother hen, and Kefalk is encouraging the men to engrave the damage to their armour and display it as badges of honour." Dawn turned his head to look straight at Dantalion, his question obvious. The captain stood ramrod straight and declared, "I tell the men to get back to their drills, that their Primarch will return soon and will not be impressed with such laxity." "How can I face my men after this?" said Dawn, looking away to the dying fire, a hint of self-recrimination edging his voice. "We had a chance at finishing this war once and for all, but it was stolen from us. Stolen by that accursed brother of mine. At least the traitors had the daring to outright try and kill me, not inflict this humiliation." Sir, you're not alone in your anguish," said Dantalion. "These men are confused and demoralized, and they need their Primarch, now more than ever. You are more than a warrior. You are a leader of men, and you do not have the luxury of wallowing in self-pity." Rogel's head snapped back, and he snarled with a dangerous tone. "Have care! I am not Russ, to allow my subordinates to speak to me thus. You risk more than your command addressing me so." "Much must be risked in war," said Dantalion briskly. "The man who is not prepared to risk his life is guaranteed to lose it." "You think we are at war?" said Dawn. "Of course, sir," replied Dantalion. "Despair is the greatest enemy of all, and this surrender to it shames you." In a heartbeat, the Primarch leapt to his feet, looming over them, and for a moment they saw how deeply his grief and ire truly ran. He bound it in chains of duty and obedience, but it was every bit as dangerous as Angron's rage or Horus's ambition. More so, for he focused and channeled it with laser intensity. This was the power that had driven him to strike down Altharius and stand undaunted against the traitors on the walls of terror. The captain saw how thin Rogel Dawn's control over his emotions had worn, and with it the realization that they were in as much danger now as they had stood within the iron cage. Pollux, however, refused to be daunted, willing to risk all to speak truth to his lord. "Sir, this path was set for us 7 years ago, born out of your grief for your father, grief we all share. But for you, there is more. You grieve for the dead. You grieve for the dead future, for the ideals that fell with him." Rogel Dorn threw his fist against the wall so hard marble shattered and chips ricocheted off the marine's armour. "I failed!" he roared, at last giving voice to the knowledge he had been denying in his heart. "Worse than at Terra, worse than when I let the traitors slip past Cadia. I swore to end this heresy once and for all, even if it cost me everything. But now we will never be free of chaos." "My lord, the iron cage was never the ending you hoped it would be. It was something greater. It was a beginning," replied Dantalion consolingly. "It was a crucible, the purging of the past to leave the purity of something new. Future generations shall know it was the rite of passage for the forging of something greater." "How?" snarled Rogel Dorn. "How exactly do we move on from this?" "Perhaps by accepting the help of others," replied Dantalion. "Your brother came to save you despite all your harsh words. He did this not out of pride or superiority, but because he remains your brother. He bears you no ill will. His vision of the future may not be very glorious, but it is achievable." "You would have me break the legions?" snarled Dorn. "Sever all our bonds of fellowship and scatter our forces to the 9 vectors?" "If necessary, sir," stated Pollux resolutely. "Necessity?" said Rogel. "Malcador and his ilk used to say that. I despised it then, and I despise it now. None of them understood what we were struggling to preserve. Nobody understands what I am fighting for now." "I do understand, my lord," said Dantalion softly. "You are an idealist. It was what gave you the strength to stand when all else seemed lost. All your sons continue to hold those ideals higher than their own lives. But the iron cage has shown us that our methods are outdated. To preserve our ideals, we must accept that the universe has changed and adapt to meet it." "Guilliman overestimates the effectiveness of his chapters," growled Dorn, turning his back on the Marines. "In another 3 hours, the traitors would have regrouped and utterly crushed his mongrels." "With respect, sir," said Pollux, "the chapter system is not intended for mass battles or attrition warfare. It is designed for rapid strikes and the destruction of critical objectives. Hit and run, doing maximum damage and withdrawing before the enemy can respond. The fusion of what is best in all the Legion's philosophies." Rogel Dorn stood for long seconds, gazing at the wreckage of his chambers, thinking upon his methods and where they had led him. Then he looked up and stared at the stained glass rendition of the Emperor. For the first time in 7 years, he allowed himself to ask the question, what would his father do? Slowly, the Primarch said, "There would have been safeguards, provisions made should we meet a foe beyond one chapter's ability to match." "A fail-safe protocol?" asked Pollux. "A last wall," replied Dorn firmly, "to hold against the ultimate enemy." "A most wise decision, sir," said Dantalion, the relief evident on his face. "Very well," said Dorn, some of the fire returning to his eyes at last. "Send an astropathic message to Rabute. Tell him I shall meet him on Terra to discuss this Codex Astartes." "Yes, sir," said Pollux. "The men will be heartened to hear that you are resuming command." "I was always in command," he reprimanded. "However, I allowed my emotions to cloud my judgment. Never again. I shall return to the iron discipline demanded of us by the Emperor, as will my legion. My chapter." "Very good, sir," said Pollux, secretly pleased to see his Primarch's spirit returning. "This will be a new beginning for all of us."
"Pollux, sound advice as always. Go make this happen," declared Dawn. "Dantalion, I shall remember your words. You truly are an exemplar of the fists."
The captains bowed, then turned to leave to begin the rebirth of the Imperial Fists.